I'm Felipa, and today is day 109 of my 365-day commitment to complete reading this Bible. So, as we kind of learned yesterday, there's a great mourning of Mordecai and the Jews, and Mordecai makes an appeal to Esther, and he says, please talk to the king and help save us. And she says, well, the king needs to call on me, so if I go to him uncalled for and present myself in court, he might kill me, but I will do so to save my people. So Esther risks the king's disfavor to bring her request to him. So she shows up in court. He extends her the golden scepter that was in his hand, and she touches it, and that essentially means that she is not going to be killed. He is allowing her to be there. And she says, I have prepared a banquet for you. I'm inviting you and Haman, the person who is after Mordecai and the Jews. And she says, please come to this banquet I've prepared for you. And he says, what would you like? You're preparing this banquet and I'll give you anything you want. And she says, just show up to the banquet. This little section talks about how Haman is disgraced because of Mordecai, because he went out in the king's gate and he sees Mordecai, who doesn't bow to him or is stirred by him at all. And he goes home and he tells his wife and his friends that he's really pissed off. And they basically say to him, like, make some gallows and essentially like hang this guy. And he's very pleased about this idea. Then the king that night couldn't sleep. So he asks that one of his people to bring him the book of the records of the Chronicles. And they start reading this. And they read this section to King Ahasuerus about how Mordecai protected the king from the two chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who wanted to kill the king, who wanted to assassinate him. And the king says, has anything been done for this Mordecai who saved me from this trouble? And the people that are serving him say, no, nothing's been done to say thank you for the fact that he saved your life. So funnily, very, very funny, Haman comes to the king's court, and without knowing what had happened, without knowing that the king couldn't sleep and that the book of Chronicles was read to him, and that it was mentioned that Mordecai had saved his life, the king says, if you were to see somebody, if you were to interact with a person who is very good to the king, how would you treat him, essentially? How would you honor him? And Haman, silly, and funnily, thinks that the king is speaking about him. And so he says, oh, well, I would, put him in all this beautiful apparel, and he would be one of the most noble princes, and he would be brought on horseback through the street of the city, and all this sort of stuff. And so Haman thinks that the king's talking about him. But then the king says, that's great. I like your idea. Now go do this to Mordecai. So Haman is just like destroyed about this. And he goes back to his house after he does all this. He like showers Mordecai in this apparel, brings him on horseback through the city, proclaims to all the people how much he's favored by the king. And then he goes home and he's just pissed off, and he tells his wife and his friends about this. And they really, really kind of cautioned him. Because they say, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but thou shalt surely fall before him. So they're very cautious, and they kind of tell him, you know what? Do not go against the Jewish people, especially if Mordecai is the seed of the Jews and he's also favored by the king. Don't go against him. So finally, Esther has this banquet. She calls Haman and she calls the king to it. And once again, the king asks her, what would you like? Tell me all your requests. And here we have a depiction of Esther and King Ahasuerus and Haman looking all ashamed. And the king says, why have you called me? And she says, this really terrible thing has happened. Haman has ordered the killing of my people. And the king is super pissed, and he essentially sends for Haman to be hung by the very gallows he built for Mordecai. So essentially karma. Mordecai is promoted by the king, and Esther makes another plea, and she asks the king to reverse Haman's letters, the ones that were issuing out essentially the killing and the destruction of the Jews. And the And it's interesting because the king's scribes come in, and the king gives his ring, he gives his ring to kind of stamp the letter and to officiate and to say that this is now going to be a sealed decision. But he also, interestingly enough, says that any of the king's decrees can't be taken back and can't be reversed. And so originally Haman had sent out a decree on in the word of the king, essentially saying all the Jews need to be destroyed and killed. So that can't be reversed. But what Mordecai and Esther do, and with the help of the scribes, they write out letters and posts and these decrees, and they say, for whoever is the enemy of a Jewish person, the Jewish people should destroy them back and stand up for themselves. So this is how we go on forward. And so essentially, that's what ends up happening. The Jewish people end up killing and slaying and defending themselves, slaying their enemies, and many people are slayed. And Haman's 10 sons are hung upon the gallows. And then, based off of the situation, there's a feast, there's a day of gladness and of rest. And it says that Mordecai and Esther instituted the festival of Purim for the Jewish people to remember this sorrow and this month that was so difficult for them and how they had prevailed through it all. And then this section just ends on saying how Esther and Mordecai wrote these letters, told people to remember and to keep this festival and this memory of Purim, and to fast and whatnot. And then the last section is chapter 10 of Mordecai's greatness, that just kind of summarizes and says that Mordecai continued to be in the power and in the favor of the king, and that for Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. So kind of, a great way for him to go down in history in terms of being in the favor and in honor of the king, and continuing to represent his Jewish brothers and sisters. This is where I end the book of Esther, and I officially move into the book of Job tomorrow, which is day 110 on December 19th, 2025. Thank you for listening.